Good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine of Politics and Prose. And on behalf of the entire staff, I'd like to welcome you here. With exquisite timing, we happen to have a senior member of the Washington Post with us. Dan Balz thought he was coming to talk about his book on the 2012 election. But in the wake of Monday's surprise announcement that the Washington Post is being sold to Jeff Bezos, I would guess that at least a few people here are interested in what's happening and what's going to happen where Dan works. We'll no doubt get to that. But let me just say that whether Dan is discussing the goings-on at the Washington Post or the ups and downs of a presidential race, he has always stood out among journalists for his smart insights, keen ability to synthesize, clear writing, and ever calm and composed manner. At a newspaper that has prided itself first and foremost for its political coverage, there's a reason that Dan emerged in recent years as the chief correspondent. And it's not because everyone else around him either died or retired. I worked at the Post, starting there about the time that Dan did in 1978, and I've seen him in action many times. His thoroughness, fairness, intelligence, and steadiness have long made him an unassuming star. He's been a White House correspondent, political editor, national editor, and became a disciple of sorts of two of the Post's great political writers, David Broder and Haynes Johnson. And Dan has carried on their tradition of unbiased, informed, and must-read coverage. His new book, Collision 2012, Obama versus Romney and the Future of Elections in America, is a follow-on to the book Dan and Haynes Johnson wrote about the 2008 campaign. And as Dan says in the new book, he hadn't expected Obama's second run for the presidency to turn out quite as compelling as the first groundbreaking one did. But it did. The campaign did turn out to be just as compelling, although in different ways. Howell Raines, reviewing the book in the Post the other day, called it, quote, old-fashioned in a good sense, referring to the fact that it's filled with attributed quotes and close focus reportage and thankfully lacks windy analysis. But Dan also shows a modern-day appreciation for the new technologies and social media that the Obama campaign put to such effective use. If you really want to understand why the election turned out as it did and what it portends for America's political future, read this book. Now, we'll be live tweeting tonight's event, just speaking of modern technology and social media. So you can follow along and join the conversation at hashtag DanBalzDC. Dan's going to speak for a little bit, and then we will leave time for questions. If you have a question, you notice the bright lights. We're on C-SPAN, and we're also videoing the event for our own website. So please try to make it to this microphone here so that everybody can pick up your question. And afterwards, of course, Dan will be happy to stay and sign copies of his book. Just given the size of the audience, if you could, not all rush up here at once, but take some time to fold up your chairs and place them against something solid and then form a line that snakes back that way, we'd appreciate it very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dan Balz.
All right, now the windy analysis begins. So, Brad, thank you. It's a delight to be introduced by a former colleague and one with whom I have so much respect, and his wonderful wife, Lissa, when they took over Politics and Prose. Sorry. Is the mic there? Hello? There we go. All right. I'm paying tribute to Brad and to Lissa for the great work that they have carried on here at Politics and Prose. As Brad said, we have a new owner at the Washington Post. And at the risk of putting my own job in jeopardy, I want to say, please patronize this store. Buy books here. Whatever else you do is, your business. But this is one of the great bookstores in America, and we want to keep it going. Haynes Johnson and I, Haynes sadly passed away just before this book was finished. But we were here 4 years ago, I think almost on this very night. And Haynes said something that night that I want to repeat, and that is, there's nothing more gratifying for an author than to come before people who read and like books, and obviously who are interested in and care about American politics. I mean, for those of us who cover American politics and then write books about it, this is as wonderful an audience as we ever get to see. And so I thank all of you for coming out. It's a wonderful crowd. And despite what Brad said, feel free to rush forward with your books. I'm happy to sign them. As Brad said, this book is a sequel to the one that Haynes and I wrote in 2008. And as I started this book, I did have doubts, and as frankly did my publisher, about whether this campaign would produce a story that was going to be as compelling as the 2008 election. I mean, that election, as we all remember, was a historic election. And not only because we ended up electing the first African-American president in history in this country, but also for the epic struggle that he went through to win the Democratic nomination and the economic crisis that we went through, and also in a sense because of how people felt at the end of the election. I remember attending a focus group maybe a year and a half, 2 years after the election. It was run by Peter Hart, who was doing it for the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And he asked people, put yourself back to election night 2008 and tell me what you felt and what you thought. And this was a focus group of Republicans, Democrats, people who had supported Obama, people who had supported John McCain. And any number of the people who had supported John McCain said, I actually felt good after that election. And Peter said, why? And they said, I just felt good for the country. I felt that the country had done something important and significant. And even though I wanted John McCain to win, I felt that something important had happened. We knew that this campaign in 2012 was not going to be that. This was not an uplifting campaign by any stretch of the imagination. It was a totally different one, and it was in many ways a much more sprawling story than we had dealt with in 2008. It had a much bigger cast of characters and an unusual cast of characters, which we'll no doubt talk about tonight. It had a lot of plot twists and some bizarre moments. When the 2008 campaign ended, we interviewed President-elect Obama and said at the opening, before we get to other questions, before you became a politician, you were a writer. He had obviously written a wonderful book, Dreams from My Father. He's a very elegant writer. He said, how would you write the story of your own election? And he said, well, I think it was a novel, and I was not the most interesting character in it. And so he proceeded. So I was thinking, I was not able to interview the president after this election for this book, but I've been thinking, how would he answer that question about this election? I mean, there were times when it was a comic opera, obviously. There were times when it was as serious as we have seen, and moments of tension and anger. My colleague, David Marinis, said to me at one point during the campaign, during the early stage of the Republican race, he said, with all due respect to all of you good political writers, he said, we really need Hunter Thompson right now to be able to explain what's really going on. So this was what I was dealing with as we started out this 2-year cycle from the end of the 2010 midterms until the November election. And yet at the end of it, I thought that it produced a story that not only was as compelling as the other, but in some ways more important. And I say that because I think this campaign was much more of a window into where America has been, a divided America, and also where it may be going, and this struggle that we were in, and also that it is more instructive of this moment in American politics than the campaign was 4 years ago. In some ways, that campaign may have been a false dawn. We thought something might happen as a result of it, and it did not. And I think there were no illusions about this campaign all the way through it. And as a result, as I sat down to write this story, it was both more challenging and, in the end, in some ways, more satisfying to try to be able to unpack what had happened and repack it and tell it. I called this book Collision 2012. I mean, to be honest, I called it Collision 2012 because I couldn't quite think of something else when I did the prospectus. But when I got into the campaign, I thought there were three reasons why that title was the apt title. The first reason is this election in 2012 was a collision between the America that elected Barack Obama in 2008 and the America that swept Republicans into power in the House of Representatives in 2010. Now, there's some simple answers to that. There was a somewhat different electorate. And yet, these were two Americas that were coming together on the political battlefield in 2012 to try to settle the argument that was there. This was also a collision of philosophies, economic philosophies, the role of government. These are two political parties who have significantly different views of what ought to be done. And this was a campaign that offered at least the opportunity for a pretty grand debate about that. And the third reason was that this was a collision of very different personalities. I mean, if you think of where these two candidates came from and how they got to where they are, it is hard to think of a greater contrast in past presidential campaigns. President Obama, the son of a white woman, an African father, an absentee father who abandoned him and the family when he was a kid, raised sometimes by his single mother and often by his grandparents as his mother was working on her doctorate. Mitt Romney grew up in a traditional family and a family of privilege and affluence. His father was a successful business person, later governor of Michigan, later a presidential candidate, at least for 10 minutes or so. And their perceptions of the world were shaped by totally different experiences. Romney's view of the economy and government shaped almost entirely by his role as a business person. And Obama's shaped by the world in which he grew up and the identity in which he sought and became, and the role of a community organizer. And if you think of those two different worlds, the two different Americas and the two different philosophies, Collision 2012 turned out to be a very apt title. Now, in a book like this, there are two ways, or in the retelling of any campaign, there are two ways to try to do it. And one is from the inside out. I mean, one of the great challenges of doing a campaign book, frankly, is that, you know, in my role as a daily journalist and all my terrific colleagues who we cover these campaigns in such minute detail that by the time you get to the end of it, you feel you know everything there is to know. And yet, if you're writing a book about it, part of what your publisher wants and part of what you want to do is be able to tell more. And so much of that comes from inside. What was really happening inside the two campaigns? What were the strategies that were going on? What were the arguments that were going on? And so a lot of reporting goes into that. This book is the product of several hundred interviews conducted over a 2-year period, some of them done as part of my daily reporting and some done strictly for the book on the condition that the contents of the interview not be revealed until the book was out. This is a tricky thing if you're writing daily journalism because the people you're interviewing know you're doing that. And so I've always tried to say, let's talk about events of the past, not of the moment. But I've always felt it's important to try to get people to talk honestly about things of the moment, because it's easy for campaign operatives afterwards to revise and extend and to shape the story in a different way. I was pleased in this book that there actually is quite a lot of new material, in part because I was able to get a number of the people who ran for president to sit down either in the course of the campaign to talk about what they were seeing and feeling, or to sit down afterwards. I did a long interview with Governor Romney in late January. It was a week after the inauguration here, and I spent 90 minutes with him at his home in just outside of Boston. It was a fascinating interview. It was interesting in a number of ways. One is there was nobody else there. I mean, normally, I was used to seeing Mitt Romney surrounded by Secret Service and family and staff and aides and handlers and advance people and all of that. I knocked on his door. He greeted me at the door. There was nobody else there. I had the only recorders that were running. I always use 2 recorders because I've had some experiences with one that when you lose an interview, you feel like you've lost half your vital organs. And so I always use 2. I put them down between us and just began asking him questions. He was not defensive. He was gracious. It's not easy, frankly, for somebody who has just poured what he poured into that campaign, as all people who run for president do, to sit down and have a reporter ask a lot of questions about, well, why'd you do this, or why'd you do that, or why didn't you do a better job of this? But he was good about it. There were some interesting things that came out of it, particularly some of the doubts that he had about whether he should run at the beginning of the campaign, whether he was the right person to run and take on President Obama, why he ultimately changed his mind on that and felt that he was the right person and the strongest Republican, and why he was so confident on Election Day. I said, "You thought you were going to win?" And he said, I did. He said, I was quite confident. He said, not 90% confident, but he said, I had written a victory speech and I had not written a concession speech. And we later learned that Paul Ryan on that Election Day was talking to people about resigning immediately as chair of the House Budget Committee. He was so certain that he was going to become vice president-elect. He also talked about some of the difficult moments. He talked about self-deportation, perhaps one of the most damaging utterances we've seen in a debate, beyond oops, and more consequential because this was a person who was about to become the nominee and not a person who was soon to exit the stage. He has a totally different view of this, and it's interesting to hear him explain it. His view is that this was not a harsh expression. It was a more benign way of talking about people going back and leaving the country. He said, in my view, deportation is a harsh policy. And he said, this president has deported a lot of people. And he said, my view was, I was saying self-deportation with the idea that if there aren't jobs available, people will go back. But he still was wrestling with why that had become so controversial. We talked at the end about the 47% comment. This is one in which he still was digesting it. He got up, he got his iPad out, he tried to read me some of the things that he thought he had said. He still said he didn't say what he actually said. He said, I didn't really say that. But he said, I knew it. He said, but that became the perception. In fact, it was both the reality and the perception. But nonetheless, he said, I knew it was damaging. It was a very bad moment for him. And at the end, I said to him, Governor, I said, do you think we were in an environment in which someone with your profile, your life experience, your wealth, the kind of life you've led, that in an environment in which most of the country, and particularly the middle class, thinks that the rich are doing great and they're getting left behind, that it would always be impossible for somebody like you to get elected. And he said, I knew that was a problem. I knew that, my profile was a problem. I thought I could overcome it. And obviously he couldn't. I won't go into all the interesting stuff that came out of the post-election and during the election interviews. The Chris Christie stuff, frankly, is fascinating. He is a character that we're going to continue to see on the public stage. And I went up to see him in Trenton and just said, tell me about, this was in September of last year, tell me about the decision process you went through in deciding not to run. And we were scheduled to talk for about 45 minutes, and an hour and a half later, he was still telling me this story. It's a fascinating story, and he's a fascinating storyteller. I'll just give you one anecdote. He was invited to a breakfast in New York in the summer of 2011. The campaign was well underway at that point. And there were a group of money people in New York who were urging him to run, and one of them invited him to a breakfast. And he said, I thought this would be a relatively small gathering. He said, I walked in the room, there were 60 people there. And they were, I thought it would be informal. There were chairs like this lined up. There was a speakerphone on the table at the front. Some heavy hitters were calling in and urging him to run. He said the last person to speak was Henry Kissinger. And he had some conversations with Kissinger. And he said Kissinger came to the front using his cane, and he said, I've known ex-presidents in my life. He said, being president is about two things, courage and character. He said, you have both, and your country needs you. And I said, well, what did you say? And he said he was as close to speechless as Chris Christie ever is. So he wasn't speechless. But he said, I said to the group, I don't think I'm going to run, but I owe it to all of you to think about it. And he then laid out for me the process by which he went through. And it is a really interesting moment in the campaign. And because he's going to be around, we will hear more of him. There's interesting, the Rick Perry interview is interesting in part because when we talked about that iconic moment, if you will, the oops moment, he was very funny about it. He said, I went into that debate feeling more confident and relaxed than any debate up to that point. He said, I was doing good, and then I had this brain lapse. That's not the word he used, but if you read the book, you'll see what he said. But he said, I thought, okay, this happens to people. It's not going to be that bad. And he said, I went back to my hotel. I mean, they did some immediate repair work nonetheless. But he said, I went back and I slept fine that night. But he said, the truth is, these are my words, but paraphrasing him, my campaign was already over at that point. He said, I didn't lose the election or the nomination because of what happened in that oops debate. He said, I had lost it earlier because of my performance in those early debates. And he said, the thing I learned was you can't get into a presidential campaign late if you're not fully prepared. And he said, I wasn't prepared for it. So there's fresh material, I think, on the Denver debate. Again, I won't dwell on all the details, but this was the high point for Governor Romney, as he said. He said, I had a lousy September, that was 47%. I had a great October, that was Denver. The day of or before the debate, he got a call from George W. Bush. And the former president said to Mitt Romney, don't worry about the debate, you're going to do fine. I know from my own experience the president is not going to be fully prepared. This is, in fact, a truism that incumbent presidents who run for re-election often lose the first debate that they have. There are a lot of reasons. One is they haven't been spoken to for 4 years the way they're about to be spoken to by an opponent. Their aides are somewhat more respectful than their opponent on the debate stages. Second, they think they're prepared because they've been dealing with these issues and they just don't feel like they need to, freshen up. He didn't have a good mock debate. His mock debates were from mediocre to really bad. And the day of the debate, I ran into one of his people in the morning out in Denver and said, what do you think? And this person said, I'm really worried. I don't think he's ready for tonight, and I'm worried about what's going to happen. As a result of that, the stakes were a lot higher in the later debates, and there's a great moment when the next debate, as you recall, was the vice presidential debate. Vice President Biden arrives in Danville, Kentucky, which is where the debate was held at Center College. He's on the tarmac, and he's in his limousine taking a call, and he comes out, excuse me, and he said to one of his aides who was there, I know we're really in trouble. And the aide said, well, what do you mean? He said, I know we're in trouble because the president just said to me, Joe, be yourself. He said, he's never said that to me in 4 years. And in fact, he was himself that night, and it helped re-rally the Democratic base as a result of that election. One of the things I tried to do in telling the inside story was to talk about the development by the Obama campaign of the middle class message, which really in many ways was one of the most strategic things they were able to do, and all of the research that went into it. They went to some extraordinary lengths to try to understand better kind of what was in the psyche of the American voter, including a project in which they asked people to fill out journals, not about politics, but about their own lives financially, economically, which produced a 1,400 pages of raw material, which was then digested down, which ultimately became a message that allowed them basically to leapfrog beyond the question of how do you feel about the economy and how do you feel about the president's handling of the economy, to a question which was one that they felt where they were on stronger ground, which was which of these two candidates do you think will be better for your family 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And it was important. And the other innovative thing they did, and we can talk more about this in the questions because I'm sure there will be some, is all of the work they did on the get out the vote operation, and particularly the data mining, the analytics, the modeling, the use of Facebook and social media to give them much more understanding of each of you, if you will, particularly if you lived in Ohio, not the district or Maryland. They were less worried about that. But if you lived in Ohio, they knew a lot about you. And so that when they went out on the streets, they weren't just randomly knocking on doors of people. They knew whose doors they needed to knock on, either to convince them to get out to vote because they were certain if they got them out, they'd vote for the president, or that they were actually persuadable, because a lot of people who say, I'm undecided, aren't really undecided, and they develop metrics to figure that out. So that's one way to tell the story, and that's a part of this book. But the other way to tell a story about a presidential campaign is from the outside in. And by that, what I mean is we concentrate so much on the television ads and the strategy and the debates and this moment or that moment or this gaffe or that gaffe, and we get overly fixated on it. And yet the things that often decide elections are the things that are in the background, the forces that are changing everything. So in this, one was obviously the economy. I mean, the question all along was, would this economy be just good enough to allow the president to win re-election, or just bad enough to deny him re-election? And as the year went along, particularly in the final couple of months, the economy improved enough that it made it easier for the president to win. And Governor Romney believes this, and so did some of his senior advisors. That one of them, I said, what do you think made the difference? And he said it was the shift in the economy in the last months. There were more elements than that, but that's one. Voter anger is clearly another one. This was always just beneath the surface, if not right at the surface in this campaign, and it was a question of would it direct itself in one direction or another. I think in the end it did not. I mean, in some ways the conditions for a third-party candidacy were certainly there because of disaffection across the political spectrum about this city and its inability to get some things done. But it didn't, and I think that the reason it didn't is the third big force that was there, and that is the red-blue divide in America. I don't think you can, at this stage in American politics, overstate the importance of that. We are a country that is deeply embedded red and blue, and in this election, as you look at the results, you could argue that red got redder and blue got bluer. This was a relatively close election. I mean, it wasn't a landslide by any means. It was not as close as it probably could have been. It was a 4-point election. There were only 4 states that were decided by 5 or fewer points. Most states were decided by 7 points or 8 points or 10 points, or some states, including our biggest states, whether it's New York or California or Texas, by landslide margins. The number of counties that switched from one party to the next in this was about the lowest ever. It was 207 counties. This is a red and blue country, and in the end, it's like, despite everything else or along with everything else, people sorted themselves out in the end, red or blue. If people said, I identify with the Republican Party, 90 to 95% were going to vote Republican, and the same with the Democrats. That has become one of the most significant aspects of our politics. And the fourth, if you're thinking outside in, the fourth great force that was crucially important and was the demographic changes that we've seen over the last several decades. Each presidential campaign by presidential campaign, the electorate becomes a little less white in its composition. It's still predominantly white, but it goes down a couple of percentage points with each election. It was 74% white in 2008, which was the lowest it had ever been. I went to Chicago back in the spring of the election year and sat down with Jim Messina, the campaign manager. And I was interested in exploring this phenomenon. So I said, give me your sense of what the electorate will look like on Election Day. And he said, we believe that it will be 72% white and 28% non-white. And that is what it turned out to be. Barack Obama won this election despite winning the smallest share of the white vote of, I believe, any winning Democratic candidate that we've seen. He was able to win because he got 80% of the non-white vote. And after the election, the Republicans kind of woke up and said, we've got a problem here. This is a problem that's been staring Republicans in the face for a long time. They may or may not be starting to deal with it, but smart Republicans and we've heard any number of Republican strategists talk about this for the better part of a decade. I mean, some of the people around George W. Bush recognized this and were warning the party, and yet Mitt Romney ended up getting just 27% of the Hispanic vote, and that is a permanent recipe for losing presidential elections unless they are able to change that. And so, what I tried to do in this book was marry up the inside story with the outside story to remind people that the genius of one campaign versus another is often overstated. The winners are never quite as good as we like to say, and the losers are never quite as bad as we like to say. Having said that, the Romney campaign, if there was a significant error on the part of the Romney campaign, and all losing campaigns look back with a lot of what ifs. What if we had done this or that? I mean, we can go chapter and verse on some things. The single biggest mistake they made was their misestimation of what the electorate would look like on Election Day. They overestimated the percentage of the white vote, and they underestimated the gap between Democrats and Republicans in the composition of the electorate. And it's why their polling had the race closer than the Obama campaign's polling and a lot of public polling. And so these are the forces that will continue to shape our politics as we head toward 2016. So with that, I will take your questions. Thank you.
First of all, I wanted to say, before I talked about the political question I have, you and I share something. I was a copy boy at the Washington Times-Herald in 1954 when we went with the Post, and I went over to the Post with Al Friendly was the managing editor, and so I've been through a little bit of that experience.
Great.
The question I have, and I've done politics for over 40 years, some 300 campaigns, and my specialty is community organizing and grassroots organizing. And the slight impression I have is that, from what I read in the Washington Post excerpt, is that they discovered something that the Bush people had discovered previously, but in fact, person to person has been the ultimate campaign since, well, Lincoln talked about it in 1856. It's not new, it's the technology. And I've developed a lot of the technology, and I think you're 1,000% correct. This divide is permanent because of technology. Today, all of the districts have been reshaped so that it's virtually impossible to have anyone running in a district that could shift back and forth.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if it's really the presidential campaigns or if it's the more substantive matter of the Republicans having control of state houses and control of the districts.
Well, we talk a long time tonight about the impact of redistricting, and there's a debate among political scientists and others about are all our problems the result of redistricting? Some people say yes. I would say only in part. Now, obviously, with technology, you can draw these bizarre districts in order to carve out advantages for one party or the other. But the other reality is that we live in America in which people tend to sort themselves out to live near more like-minded people. We just see evidence of that around us, and so that is part of it. Your point about the person-to-person campaigning is correct. I mean that good campaigns have always wanted to get volunteers out on the street, but what the Bush campaign, based on some work done by some political scientists at Yale, I won't say perfected, but improved this by recognizing it's not just person to person that's effective. It's if I go to your door because you know me. And so if you're called by somebody you know, or if your door is knocked by somebody you know, you are more likely to respond to that than simply a stranger knocking on your door. And what the Obama campaign discovered was that's not just at the door, that through Facebook, they were able to tap into, with your permission, they could tap into your Facebook friends. And from their own data, they knew what those friends' predilections were, how they tended to vote, which party they supported, what issues they cared about. And so let's say you watched a video on their campaign site about healthcare. You might get an email from the campaign that said, you just watched this healthcare thing. You've got 3 friends on Facebook who might be interested to see this same video. Why don't you send them a message to encourage them to do that? It was that kind of precision. And I talked to Jen O'Malley Dillon, who was the deputy campaign manager overseeing a lot of the Get Out the Vote operation. And I said to her, do you still believe that the door-to-door is the most effective way of campaigning? And she said, until this election, I would have said yes, that is. But she said, what we now know is that different people want to be contacted in different ways. And what we learned is, we figured out what's the right way to contact you versus the right way to contact you. And that was part of what they did. Now, again, let me just add this caveat, because you can talk to the people at headquarters and they can describe this architecture in the most beautiful way and talk to you about the amazing software they've got and the data analysis they've done. You then go out on the street with people and, they don't quite handle it in the exact same way. I mean, these are volunteers, they're committed, but they're not necessarily going to read the script that they were given. So it's a little sloppier on the street than it sounds like at headquarters. Having said that, there's no question that the Obama campaign was more efficient at this than the Romney campaign. Thank you.
Patricia Fenn, is this on?
Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me?
Just speak loudly into it.
Patricia Fenn from Prince George's County. Thank you for coming. We're thrilled that you're here.
Thank you.
Can you comment on 2 aspects of the Romney campaign? I was flabbergasted that there was such a disconnect between Romney's performance as a governor, his performance in the primary, and then how he turned around on so many issues toward the general election. I thought there was an entire disconnect in those issues. And then I wanted you to comment about how Romney got so many things wrong, fundamentally wrong about where the electorate was going to be.
On the first, I mean, when we talked about why he had doubts, this was in the excerpt that the Post ran a couple of weeks ago. But there was a family gathering in December of 2010. Mitt and Ann Romney, 5 sons, 5 daughters-in-law. They had done this in 2006. It's kind of a family council about should he or shouldn't he run for president. In 2006, as they were looking at 2008, it was a unanimous vote in favor. 2010, it was 10 votes no and 2 votes yes, and Mitt Romney was one of the no votes. So we talked about that, and he said 2 things. One was, he said, if another Republican who I thought would have been stronger to run against President Obama had gotten in the race, and he specifically mentioned Jeb Bush, I might not have run. Take that with a little grain of salt, but he was willing to say that at the time he thought there might be better candidates. He said, in terms of the Republican nomination, Stuart Stevens, his chief strategist, always said, here's what we're up against. This is a Southern-based party, and you're a Northerner. This is an evangelical-based party, and you are a Mormon. this is a very conservative party and you are a more moderate conservative from Massachusetts, it's always going to be a struggle. And one of the things that we saw with Governor Romney, both in the 2008 campaign and the 2012 campaign, was this question of, he had run in one way in Massachusetts. You could not win the Republican nomination in 2008 or 2012 with some of those positions, particularly on abortion. He had been pro-choice, and he switched on that. So it was a question of what he would do, and there was a big debate. Well, actually, there wasn't a big debate. There was the big issue of would he walk back from his health care plan in Massachusetts, and Neil Newhouse, who became his pollster, went up to Massachusetts to pitch the campaign to become the pollster. This was as they were ramping up. And he had done a poll himself just to be armed with some data. And one of the things he said was, the Massachusetts healthcare plan is a big problem with a lot of Republican voters, in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina, the three crucial early states. And he said, you've got some options. You could walk away from it, say it was a mistake, I wouldn't do it again. You could say, Governor Patrick has taken it and distorted it, and I don't agree with what. And he said, before I could basically finish, Romney said, I'm not walking away from it. I'm not going to walk away from it. Case closed. And part of the reason he wasn't going to do that was because he genuinely believed that that was the right thing to do. Others in the campaign said they recognized that had he walked away from it, even if that had seemed like the politically smart thing to do, that he would have been charged with being a flip-flopper. So it would have brought back. So he had this conflict about consistency. One of the reasons he said he talked about immigration in the debates the way he did was he said, I had a record in Massachusetts, and it was consistent with what I said in the debates. He said, I couldn't suddenly in the debates claim I was in a different position. So he was conflicted. I don't think after the primaries he ever effectively moved to the center as well as some people had thought he should do until the first debate. And when I talked to him about that, he argued that it wasn't a move to the center. It was a fuller presentation of who he was. He said, he said you get defined by short sound bites and and he said this was the first time a big national audience could see the totality of what I thought. But so that was it. On the miscalculation, I think it goes back to what I had said right at the end of my regular remarks, and that is they just thought the electorate was going to be different. They did not think. They thought that the African American vote in raw numbers, not necessarily percentages, but in raw numbers, could not be as large as it had been in 2008 because that was the first time an African American had run for president, and they just thought that the enthusiasm level would not be as great. And it turned out that the African American vote was as significant. So they just made some miscalculations.
Thank you. Larry Checco. And I want to thank you for your columns. They're very insightful.
Thank you.
You covered a lot of ground tonight. And but one thing I was surprised that you didn't refer to, and I think it's a thing that a lot of people had in their heads as this was being played out, but racism. Was there a latent racism in this campaign where you felt that perhaps a lot of the white voters just wouldn't go over?
Wouldn't go over to
vote for an African American again. It happened once. I was really surprised that it happened twice, actually, and I, kind of proud of that fact.
I don't know anybody who's. We've all talked about this a lot. I don't know anybody who's been able to, in any real way, quantify that. I think a lot of people have their own views as to how significant or not that was. Whenever I have talked to the Obama campaign about that, and frankly, this was more of a conversation during the 2008 campaign than in this campaign. Their view has been this ends up as a wash, that there are some people who will not vote for an African American for president, but there are other people who may be more likely to vote for him because he is African American. And the president himself has said that to me during one of our interviews for the earlier book. And so, people will continue to debate how significant it was. I don't think it was, a major factor in the outcome of the election by any means.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. Peggy Orchowski. I'm a congressional reporter for the Hispanic Outlook magazine. And I covered both the conventions. Mainly my task was to interview Hispanic delegates. And of course, I was most interested in talking to a lot of the Hispanic delegates in the Republican convention. Almost every delegation had them, and especially growing number of Mormon Hispanics. So this is something I wanted to ask you about. Something that I was really noticed the difference between the Democratic and Republican conventions was during the day when there weren't any of the big things going on television, the Republicans all met in state caucuses. That was the way they identified themselves. The Democrats all met in identity group caucuses. We had the Latino and the blacks and the gays and the lesbians and the women's and all that. And it seemed to me, as a lifelong Democrat, that, and this is what I wanted you to, what you think, that Democrats are becoming less and less tolerant of diversity. They seem to put everyone into a group. So all women supposedly vote the same. All Latinos are the same. There is the Latino vote, which there really isn't. I mean, Latinos are incredibly diverse, and we're going to see that more and more. And maybe it worked in this election, but I'm concerned for Democrats that they are getting too narrow, that they're targeting groups as if they're all monolithic. And I wonder what you think about that.
It's a really interesting question, and identity politics within the Democratic Party has been an issue that at various times has been helpful or harmful. If you've covered as long as I have, you've seen those moments when I remember Paul Kirk, when he became the Democratic Party chair, abandoned all of these caucuses because he felt that these
When
were,
was that?
this would have been back in the 80s, because he thought it was not healthy for the party to sort out in that way. At the same time, now we see somewhat more of it. It's the way that the party has organized. Partly that's the professional part of the party, in a sense, the DNC, and they do that. I don't know of what the great significance of that is. I think in a campaign sense, when you look at the Hispanic vote, for example, you're right, the Hispanic vote is certainly diverse, but it has consistently, with very few exceptions, voted with a sizable majority voting Democratic. Doesn't mean it's monolithic by any means, but it's 65, 70, 72% Democratic. Now, can Democrats take that for granted? Sure. But can Republicans crack it? That's a big question. I mean, long time ago, 30 years ago, I was in our bureau in Texas during the first Reagan administration and spent a lot of time looking at the emergence of the Hispanic vote and, in fact, efforts by the Republican Party to harness more of those voters. And they've been doing it for 30 years without a consistent record of success. They have not been able to grow it in any sizable way. George W. Bush did very well with Hispanics in Texas, and he did pretty well as president. His brother did pretty well in Florida. So that says it is possible for the party, for a candidate, to do pretty well. But if you look at Susana Martinez, the governor of the Republican governor of New Mexico, or Brian Brian Sandoval, the Republican governor of Nevada, both won elections in 2010 with a minority of the Hispanic vote in their states. I mean, it's a struggle even for a Hispanic candidate at this point. And part of it is what the two parties have stood for. One of the things that both the Romney campaign and the Obama campaign knew in this past election is, I mean, we did a lot of looking at immigration, and that was certainly a factor. But perhaps the single biggest factor that pushed more Latino voters to the Democrats was health care and the president's support of the Affirmative Care Act. So John McCain said last week on the NewsHour, he said he's obviously pushing for a comprehensive immigration bill. He said the passage of this bill will not win the Republicans one single Hispanic vote, but he said what it will do is it will put us in a position to begin to compete more effectively for Hispanic voters. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Watch them.
My name is Walter Rosenkrantz. Well, I can't put it in my mouth. All right.
Well, just speak up a little
Yeah.
more.
Oh, my name
There you go.
My name is Walter Rosenkrantz, and before retiring here, I was a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, during which time Romney was governor, part of it. What I remember, I just want to make this comment before asking my question. What I remember was
Keep speaking loudly.
What I remember was that there was a minor scandal with the landscape contractors of his home in Massachusetts. Most of them were undocumented illegal immigrants. So it's kind of hypocritical for him to talk about self-deportation when he himself was providing the jobs that they came north to take. Oh, but that's just a comment. What I want to ask you about is what do these elections portend for the future of the governability of this country? It seems that the checks and balances that we are so proud of have produced a system that cannot move at all.
That is mostly checks.
Yeah, I'm just reminded. My father was born in 1905 in Imperial Russia, in Belarusia. After World War I, his town became part of Poland, so he knew Polish and Russian history. Mm-hmm. And I remember him telling me that before the partition of Poland in the 18th century by the great powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, the Polish government was run by a parliament consisting of notables and aristocrats. And you could not do anything in the Polish parliament except by unanimous consent. So one person could bring the whole machinery of government to its knees.
And you think we're heading toward that?
And what happened was the great powers would buy off a nobleman to thwart any policy that would threaten their interests in Poland. And I'm wondering if we are anywhere close to that situation now.
I don't think we're quite in that same situation, but we used to think that elections were a moment at which we settled an argument. That the campaigns were about putting one platform or another forward and one candidate or another forward who had a set of ideas and philosophies, and that the outcome of that would give that person at least some leeway to try to implement that. This election was not that. I think the president came out of this election thinking he had a moment, that he came out of it with a sort of more muscular rhetoric. If you think of the inaugural address, it was a much more robust inaugural address than he had given 4 years earlier. And I think he thought he might be able to work his will a little bit more effectively on Capitol Hill. But he's not been able to do that, and it's in part because of this red-blue divide. And because with Republicans having a power base in the House, they're able to thwart and block, and he can't get done what he wants, and they can't get done what they want. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, my friend Roger Simon, who's here, and I talked about this over the weekend. He said, "You've written a very gloomy book." And I said, well, I don't know about that, but I said, I felt all the way through this campaign, certainly in the last 4 or 5 months, I just felt that we were going to end the campaign without having resolved the argument, that Republicans and Democrats would still be very far apart and that it would be difficult to govern. And I think this is a longer-term problem. Maybe a different set of personalities will do it. Maybe a shock to the system in some way will do it. Maybe another defeat for the Republicans in a presidential campaign would change something. I mean, politics is not static. It's dynamic. It's organic, and parties change and events change them. But right now, you have to say that this election didn't resolve the argument, produced in some ways a kind of a status quo outcome, at least in the sense that the White House, the House, and the Senate remained exactly in the same hands as they had been going into the election, and that Republicans continue to feel as strongly about what Barack Obama is doing and why it's wrong, and the president feels that he's right and that the country ought to go in that direction. I will say one of the things that I was struck by in the inaugural address was that the president seemed to be pitching his ideas to the America that he believes is now, at least in a national election, the majority America. And we will see going into 2016 how that plays out. So thank you.
Great, thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left, and it looks like we have about 4 or 5 people left in line, so maybe we could do like 1 a minute.
Okay, quick questions and short answers.
Did you find why so few
Speak into the microphone,
why
please.
so many white people did not vote?
Well, the overall vote was down. I'm not sure that any group voted in as high a numbers as they had in 2012. I mean, the overall vote for both the Republican nominee and the Democratic nominee was down. There were fewer white votes. I mean, I think one reason there were a lot of white voters who did not want to vote for President Obama. We had seen that. And there were a number of white voters, particularly some, I would say, working class voters, who may have been resistant to Governor Romney. And certainly the Obama campaign worked and spent tons of money to try to convince them not to vote. I mean, if you look at Ohio, I'll do this quickly. In Ohio, he outperformed his white vote compared to nationally because in part of the kind of campaign he ran. So, short answer. Next.
Nyborg, and I wanted to know.
Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
Okay.
There you go. Thank
Ingrid
you.
Nyborg, do you think that the current effort to suppress the vote will be successful, and if so, how will it affect the next election in 2016?
The question is, will efforts to suppress the vote be successful, and how will it affect the next election? I think you could make the argument that there was a backlash against it, and that efforts to do that come at a potential political price for the advocates of it. And we will see how much effort there is to enact laws and then what the reaction is. I mean, if you look at what happened with a lot of African American voters, the long lines in Florida in the final weekend, the huge turnout that suddenly startled the Romney campaign on Election Day in Philadelphia. The Obama campaign would say this was an assertion by African Americans of, we've got your back, President Obama, and we're not going to let anything get in our way of voting. So, this is part of a debate about election laws, but it's also part of the emotion that goes into how people decide to vote and how motivated they are to get out to vote.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening.
Hi.
My name is James Reed. I'm a student at George Washington University.
Get a little closer to the mic.
Let's see. How about now? I can speak loudly if you guys can hear me. My question concerns about the Obama family and the Romney family. You touched on it briefly, their impacts on the campaign.
Well, I think in Ann Romney and Michelle Obama, the two candidates had terrific advocates. The speech that Michelle Obama gave at the Democratic convention was arguably one of the two best speeches. I mean, this was an odd convention in that the president's speech was at best the third best speech, after Michelle Obama and Bill Clinton and maybe Mayor Castro of San Antonio, who certainly outperformed expectations. And Ann Romney gave a very effective speech at the convention and also on the campaign trail. I think always had a very natural quality about it and a determination. She was a fighter and a fighter on behalf of her husband, and so I think that both of them were helpful, and the families. I mean, I think Americans of whatever political stripe they were looked at each of those families and said, these are real families, these are good families, and so I think that they were on both sides net assets.
Thank you.
And one last question.
Daisy Foster, retired educator. Given that more whites died last year than were born, do you see, now this is what the media is saying, do you see politics in America moving toward the David Broder changing of the guard philosophy?
Well, I think this is a changing country, and demographically, you're right. I mean, the rising part of the population is the minority part of the population. I mean, there are two big parts of the population. One is the aging baby boomers, and so the older vote is actually growing, and the other is young voters, and particularly young Hispanics, and that inevitably will change our politics. But not just young Hispanics, young voters in particular. They are growing up in a world which is different than the world that most of us grew up in. It is a much more diverse world. It's a much more tolerant world on some social issues. And it's a economically quite challenged world. And that is affecting people's attitudes as they start to enter the political process. And I believe at this point that the Democrats believe that will work to their advantage. But as I said, these things are organic. And just as Bill Clinton kind of rethought and redefined the Democratic Party after 3 consecutive losses during the Reagan and first Bush presidencies, there may be a Republican on the horizon who will similarly do that and be able to capture the imagination of his or her party and then win in a national election. So it's what keeps people like me going. Thank you all very much.